Okay. Can everybody see my
Yeah, we
screen?
can see it.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
All right. So I wanted to do a talk on efficient styling with SCSS and SASS. So to get started, what is SCSS? I think is important. It's basically just a helpful way to keep your CSS organized and dry. And it's actually a gem that was originally written in Ruby, and now it comes in a whole bunch of different languages. But because it was written in Ruby, it kind of has a lot, it has like a couple of really helpful things in common with Ruby, and you can definitely tell that it was written by Ruby developers. But it's basically just shorthand CSS. It's an extension language, and it's different from SASS. So SASS is the original, and then SCSS kind of came off of that and is actually now more commonly used. So when people are talking about SASS these days, they're usually really talking about SCSS. But we're going to go over that. So one of the first things to know about SCSS is that you can build variables in it, just like Ruby, and you can define them both locally and globally. And you just build them by adding a $ to something. So you can define like your font stack or your primary color. And this is really helpful because then when you're referencing it later on throughout your style guide, you only have to change it once. So you stay like really consistent with your designs. And then when your SCSS gets compiled, it gets processed into just regular CSS. So like this is what's getting served up. And then you can do mix-ins, which are a little more complicated, and they can take, you can pass them a variable, and you can also do like multiple lines of editing at the same time. So like this box element, you want to change its border radius to be 10 pixels, but say that you're just testing it out and you want to change it to like 9 pixels or 8. You don't want to have to write that like every single time. And so you just you build a mixin called border radius, you include it, and then you pass the 10 pixels through as the variable and it changes it for you. You can also build partials, which are really simple, but like super helpful, especially if you're on a team or if your CSS starts to get really long. So what that allows you to do is just take a chunk of your CSS and put it into a different style sheet. And then as long as you put a leading underscore at the beginning of the name of your style sheet with the extension, like all of these files have the extension of .scss, you can edit that code and then you just import it into like your master or your main or like one CSS file. And what that does is that instead of like pulling up an HTTP request every single time that you're loading a style sheet, so like one for your main, one for your footer, one for your nav if you have them all separated, it'll compile them all together. And so it like saves you time and it's just serving it all up in one CSS file together, but then you don't have to look at a really long file. You can also do nesting, which is awesome. So similar to like HTML, where you can nest a div inside of another div and then like a UL and then LI. Instead of writing out like column left UL, column left LI, column left A, and probably giving column left its own like parameters as well, you can just put the parent element and then nest your UL and even nest your LI within those. And then your A is nested inside of your column left as well. And that really helps you, like, in case you change the name of this or in case you change some of the parameters around this and you like need to understand how they're related, then it's all right in one place and it's really easy to keep everything together and like organized. But you should be aware that you don't want to nest too deeply, because when your SCSS gets compiled, this will come out as column left UL LI. And you can end up making that name like really long, and what it does is it just makes it super specific, and so it's hard to reuse throughout like the rest of your code. So while it's kind of like a fine line to walk of like making it really easy and really quick, but also getting lazy and like actually writing more code than you really need to. The same can be done for extend. So extend is basically the same thing as nesting, but you're pulling from something that isn't a parent element. So you're just pulling from another element somewhere in your code. And so the example that they give is messages. So like all of our messages, success, error, and warning, have the same want to have the same parameters as message, except you want to change the border color. And so when you just extend message, you're pulling in the padding, the color, and the 1 pixel solid border, and then just changing its color. A good thing about this is that without doing an extend, a lot of the times, like I know you can forget that you've already written like a lot of this code, and then you end up just repeating it throughout your style sheet. So this is a great way to like not have to repeat yourself, but you should again be aware that if a lot of elements are really sharing the same, like same calls, then maybe you should get an overarching class that they should all share. So you have all those those are kind of like the basics. But then, like I said, like it was built with by like Ruby guys, and so there's some really cool like functions built into it and operators. So there's some like for colors, so you can pass a variable of a color that you might already have, and then an amount in, and you can desaturate that color. Or like if you want to show a button that you can't click at the moment, you could just pass its color in and then turn it into grayscale. And that's the same as desaturating at 100%. You can do numbers, so you can do like operations of adding and subtracting, but you can also round up or round down. And then you can do control directives too. So you can do if statements, which are really helpful for like debugging. So you could say like if debug, then highlight in red, and then you don't even have to inspect element when something's broken. And you can also define your own functions, which is great. So you could do make greener and then pass the value in, and it'll identify the hex code of whatever variable you're passing through and add 50 green to it and then make that color greener. So like here we're using it for a background color, and we're taking the hex code of gray, adding 50 to it, and then we're pushing out this new hex code. So here are the like the docs and the references. And then I just wanted to show this site too really quick, because I think like once you start thinking about like making your style guides a little more efficient, like this is really helpful too. So this is called SCSS Stats, and you can pass any website into this. So we'll do Twitter. And it'll basically parse your CSS and then deliver you all of the information about it. So like all of your rules, all your declarations, how many unique colors you have in it, how many background colors, font sizes, and even like how specific you have. So what I was saying with like nesting, if there's like moments for where you can improve inside of your code, you'll see that here with like where things get super, super specific. So yeah, that's it. Any questions?
Holy smokes. That was awesome.
So I have, I guess, 2 questions. The first one is, are there any like more, like you talked about how you can sort of define custom functions and such in SCSS. Are there any gems that just have like built-in ones that sort of like we should know about?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. Like built-in functions?
Like basically like they generated a whole bunch of functions that like the make greener function and just all sorts of other functions, kind of like just useful utility stuff.
So let's go, actually, I'm going to go to like the functions that are built. Can you still see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So like this is the functions that they have built in. And you can see, like I only included a couple of them, but so it can tell you, it can create a color from, like when you're doing RGB and then adding the color values, that's a function. So there's some like really basic stuff that you might use all the time. Like I've used, there's one on strings that does to uppercase, and that converts your string into an uppercase. So if you decide that you want the style on your button to be that your, like the word should be an uppercase, you can do that. Or to lowercase, which like, again, like we use in Ruby, and like you never really think about doing it in CSS or like SCSS, but it's there. You can do like percentages, rounding, ceiling, floor, absolute value. I saw an example earlier today where like if you actually go to the SASS, like SASS's page, they'll show you that you can, if you want it. So like one good thing to do is like if you decide, if you're not using Bootstrap and you want to decide where your minimum width is for a device, you can set that to a function and then do math to say like, okay, I want this to take up like 2/3 of the page, no matter how like, if the, we're at the minimum width. When you're setting, like if something is a touch screen, that's a function that you're setting. There's just so many. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so I guess there's just a ton built in that sort of like that.
Yeah, that
gives
like
a
you
ton
don't
off
even
for-
think about. It's crazy.
That's
It's like
awesome.
amazing. Yeah.
When you, is there a performance hit, like running, say, using upcase? So if we do a bunch of work and, you know, titles on our Firehose Lightning app, we want all upcase. I don't feel like going in and actually changing all that code.
Mm-hmm.
Is it quicker to do it with this way, or are we going to have any performance hits or anything like that, you know of?
So it's basically like you should be aware of like what it's going to compile to, like what I was saying with nesting, like it's going to compile to like the parent element ul li if you nest it as the parent element ul and then you nest the li inside of the ul. If you nest it as the parent element and then li, you're saying that like anytime there's an li inside of that parent element, it'll have these properties. So if you have like a list that you want to be really specific and maybe you gave the ul a class name, like that's where you hit into like, is this a really specific element? But if it's just going to compile out anyways into like the parent element ul li, it's kind of the same. One thing I did notice though is like I put in my website on here and my stats are like much higher than sometimes it doesn't work. My stats are like much higher than they should be. And so I think what's happening is that it's also like parsing Bootstrap. So if you have Bootstrap loaded, but you're not referencing like even if you're not using all of the CSS that comes along with Bootstrap, that's still loaded onto your site. Oh, I can't get it to work. But it'll still count all that. So you should be aware of like, it's more about like being aware of when you're loading a framework onto your site and that all of that CSS is still kind of getting loaded, even if it's not necessarily getting called. So it's just kind of like sitting there on your code base, like lazily. But you might end up using some of that stuff. So it's like, do you want to delete it or do you want to, like, what should you do? Should you like comment it out?
Yeah, that's definitely good to know at least.
So what advice do you have about like refactoring just like very bad CSS? Do you suggest sort of going after like this, taking all of the features that you sort of talked about and doing it all at once? Or how would, if you were to jump in into like this just mess of CSS,
yeah,
what would your tactics be?
So I had to do that actually like recently for work. And I think I think I would start with partials just because that allows you to kind of say, like it just allows you to tackle chunks of the code into different style sheets. So for me, like I would want to be able to organize it into like, today I'm going to tackle just the footer code. And then tomorrow I'm going to tackle like things that I know go on like, this screen or like the about page or whatever. Because that doesn't have any effect on like what the user sees or like time. Like all it does is it's only seen by you. And then you can go in and I think like manageably try and edit, like try and add some variables. So then you're being consistent because that's like what variables are for, right? Is to make sure that you don't have 14 different like blues for like if you decide that you want a blue in your text, or that you don't have like 12 different background colors or button types. And so start just like trying to decide, and also using like a site like your stats and seeing what you have the most of and going through and searching into, I would search like for where you're using those colors or like those textiles or whatever, and see if you can switch it to something else and kind of like start to make everything aligned.
Cool, good stuff. Does anybody else have any other questions?
have lots of questions, but they're all just specific to me. So I'll send her,
Yeah, you can.
I need refactoring help, and Ken's not the best at refactoring CSS. So
Just Slack me. Always on.
Cool.
No, that was pretty awesome just to see nesting stuff. Nesting is something that I always run into issues with. I always want to use it. I always see somebody using it, but for some reason it never renders properly in my app. So
I think one of the most, so I didn't put it in here, but I think the biggest thing about nesting or just CSS in general is like when something's not working, check that it doesn't have code, like it doesn't have styles working on it from a parent element. Because that's like, that is always the thing. That's like restarting your server. It's like always the problem, right?
Right.
Cool.
Yeah, super good talk.
Yeah, super fascinating. It makes me want to refactor a lot of the CSS stuff I've been doing today. So it kind of good timing for the talk, I guess.
Hey, inspiring Ken. That's what we all strive for.
Cool. So next up we have Diane.